In this video we want to talk about some issues related to trade unions. Now to start, trade unions came into existence to represent workers. Workers individually were in a weakened position compared to the employers. The employers could sack the workers, make them redundant, or not give employment to certain people. The employers could discriminate. They had perhaps long hours of work and poor pay, and individual workers were weak to be able to combat this, so they formed into trade unions. But the development of trade unions was not straightforward. It's a very turbulent period in economic history, in UK economic history. For example, trade unions were criminalised. People who joined the trade unions were punished under the law. The legal system did not recognise the right of workers to combine in this way to confront the employers. So power was very much with the employers, and the workers were very weakened as a consequence. Trade unions were first decriminalised under the recommendation of a Royal Commission in 1867. So they weren't decriminalised until 1867. Trade unions and the idea of coming together in combinations was around a long time before that. The Royal Commission agreed that the establishment of the organisation was to the advantage of both employers and employees. So the Royal Commission of 1867 thought that workers and management would benefit by having the workers in trade unions. The trade unions were legalised in 1871. The trade union movement sought to reform the socio-economic conditions of the workers in the UK, in industry in the UK. Various organisations were spun off of this. For example, the Labour Representation Committee, which really formed today's Labour Party in the UK. The Labour Party is a major political party in the UK. It's been in government many times over the 20th century. It's been the main opposition for a long time in the 20th century. So it's one of the main political parties, and that grew out of the trade union movement. The Labour Representation Committee, formed by the trade unions, led to the development of the Labour Party. And indeed, the Labour Party today still has extensive links with the trade union movement. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister throughout the 1980s, made a lot of efforts to try and weaken the power of the trade unions, which she saw as having gone too far. The trade unions had, mostly through legislation implemented by the Labour Party over the years, had grown in strength, and Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister in the 1980s, wanted to reduce the power of the trade unions, and this led to a lot of problems throughout the 1980s with employee relations. There were many strikes and many hard-fought battles between the two sides, government on the one side and the trade unions on the other. Later, when Tony Blair formed the Labour government, he was criticised for not having repealed all of the Thatcher reforms, all of the laws relating to the trade unions introduced by Margaret Thatcher. Most British trade unions belong to what's known as the Trade Union Congress, the TUC. Now, the TUC was formed in 1867. There are also equivalent organisations to the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, in Scotland, known as the Scottish Trade Union Congress, and in Ireland it's the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. These are umbrella organisations to which individual unions subscribe. Um, there has been a decline in the number of people in trade unions over the years, a very steep decline in the 1980s. It fell from 13 million people in trade unions in the UK in 1979 um, down to about 7.3 million in the year 2000. So it still means that the trade union organisations are very big and very powerful, but they have fallen in numbers and in power over the 1990s and the 2000s, and today their numbers are roughly equivalent to those that were in trade unions in the 1940s. Having said all of that, now let's look at some notes related to trade unions. That's sort of background ideas and information about the trade union movement and the development of the movement. So the trade unions were developed, came into existence during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a major event in the UK, and it sparked off development in many other countries, leading to the Industrial Revolution worldwide. It all started in the UK, and it meant that industrialists needed workers. But the industrialists, of course, don't want to pay too much in wages or salaries, and the workers, on the other hand, had very difficult and hard jobs to perform, and they wanted higher remuneration. But they also wanted more time off. They wanted weekends off and reasonable working weeks. They don't want to work continuously every day. They had families and they had commitments, and also the human body can only take so much. They needed to rest and recuperate. So there was constant conflict between the industrialists, the new industrialists under the Industrial Revolution, and the workers. Constant tension. But individual workers, as I said earlier, were weakened by their position because there was only one of them. And if one of them went to the industrialist and asked for more wages or better working conditions, the chances are he or she would lose their job, which was the only means of support perhaps they had to support their families. So the workers were in a very weakened position, and therefore it was in their interest to speak with one voice, to form into trade unions, to negotiate from positions of power. The initiative was put in place to provide job security for skilled workers in craft industries. Now, the craft industries were the elite industries. There were many others which were more routine. In fact, most were, in a sense, routine. There was coal mining and shipbuilding, but also the emergence of steel manufacturing later, when steel manufacturing became, when it was developed, locomotive industries and so on, road making, canals. There was a lot of activity going on, but it wasn't really craft, it was mass production. But the workers were unhappy, and clearly that state of affairs was going to lead to something, and what it led to was the formation of the trade union movement. Now, the conditions in these new industries, as I said, was very harsh, with men and women and even children forced to work long hours for very low wages. By today's standards, we would say it was very unfair. And yet, of course, today we see sweatshops around the world, and we know that the same practices are going on elsewhere in the world. It's just that the UK perhaps confronted these issues, perhaps 150, 200 years before everyone else. The workers didn't accept conditions passively. There was always agitation. The workers always tried to change the circumstances, change the working conditions. Safety, for example, was never a high concern in industry at that time. Not like it is today, for example. There were many trade disputes throughout the 1800s, and workers came together to resolve one-off problems at work. The factory owners, the government, which at the time was elected by only 3% of the population, so the government was not a full franchise like now. We didn't have women voting, for example. They were not allowed to vote. In fact, most people were not allowed to vote. Only select few were allowed. Mostly landowning gentlemen. So the government and the media were hostile towards any combination of workers to defend their rights. And that's understandable. They were the ones who were making the profits. They were the ones who wanted to get as much back as they could. So we can understand their motivation. But we can also understand the workers who had nothing, perhaps. They needed this income to sustain their families and feed their families. But on the other hand, they were working under terrible conditions, long hours, and getting little pay. What's known as the Combination Acts were passed in 1799 and 1800. This made any sort of strike action illegal. So if the workers came together in any way, agreed amongst themselves to go to the owners as one group, that was illegal. Striking was punishable by up to 3 months imprisonment or 2 months hard labour. So quite severe punishment for workers coming together. During the 18th and 19th century, the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain from a rural society, from an agricultural-based society, to one which was actively involved in industrial production in factories, textile mills and mines. So there was a complete revolution. People moving off the land, moving into industry, moving off the land into towns, and towns were becoming cities, and a lot of industry starting up, but working under very dirty, very unhygienic, very dangerous conditions, working long hours and for little pay. So as I said, all the ingredients were right for the formation of the trade union movement. The conditions in the 18th century were hostile, as I said. Men, women and children were forced to work long hours with low wages in unsafe conditions. That's the summation. That's what life was like back then. Poor working conditions encouraged workers to join groups to resolve problems and disputes at work. This caused problems with the owners and the government, leading to the Combination Acts, which made it illegal for workers to come together at all. So in 1799, the Combination Acts came into force, and this made it illegal for any combination of workers to defend their rights. So the workers could do nothing about the conditions or about their pay. It was take it or leave it. The Combination Acts made strikes an illegal action, which resulted in imprisonment, as I said. And they caused widespread protest. Workers were very unhappy about this, and there was all sorts of protests across the country. The Act was repealed in 1824, which resulted in an outbreak of strikes and campaigns. People felt a sense of relief. You can imagine that over the period of the Combination Acts, their feelings were suppressed. But when the Act was repealed, they felt the freedom to go on strike and campaign. In 1885, further acts were passed allowing trade unions to exist, but with limited powers and authority. So 1885, the trade unions were allowed to exist, but they had very limited powers and very limited authority. In 1871, the trade unions were granted legal status and recognised as legal entities and were given protection under the law. So 1871, the trade unions came into existence. And in 1875, it was made legal for trade unions to take industrial action, such as strikes. So in 1875, in a sense, the argument was won. They were allowed to take strikes. The workers could withhold their labour. The workers didn't have to work for the employer. They could stay away from work, and that would damage the employer and force the employer to concede on pay or concede on working conditions or hours of work or whatever. And don't forget, as I said, it was men, women and children involved. This was a very harsh regime. But there again, the world had never seen anything like this before. This was industrialization. But from 1875, the trade unions began to grow and organisations formed to support skilled and unskilled workers. So the trade unions were related to skilled workers, craft workers, but also unskilled workers. So the trade unions started to take on responsibility and roles and were developed for all types of workers. During the 1880s, trade unions grew rapidly and were gaining interest amongst unskilled and women workers. Female workers were broadly ignored through all of this, and their working conditions were appalling. But throughout the latter part of the 1800s, ladies' trade unions, women workers, were more and more recognised, and they had to fight for their rights. But this time they had the support of the general trade union movement. The case was fair. If the case was fair, it was supported. Having said that, there were documented areas where some trade unions or some members of trade unions were reluctant to take action on behalf of the women's workers because, I suppose, prejudice. But by and large, they did get support. So the trade union movements became involved in a range of industries, including cotton, coal, engineering, iron and steel. The coal mining union became very strong. Coal miners worked for individual employers. The coal mines were owned by individual owners, and later on this would lead to a very famous strike in 1926, the general strike as it was called. But the point I'm trying to make here is the trade unions spread out and started to cover all the major areas of employment. A great number of strikes took place during this period. For example, in 1888, the women workers strike at the Bryanton May match factory in London. Matches were an important commodity because many people smoked cigarettes or smoked pipes. Mostly pipes, I think, back then. But a match was used to light the pipe or light a fire in the house. So it was quite a big business. But as you can imagine, a very dangerous business to work in. This was tantamount to working with explosives. So these women worked under extremely dangerous conditions, and eventually they were organized sufficiently to be able to go on strike and to negotiate with the company and get some concessions. There was also a famous strike in 1889, the Dockers strike. The dockers went on strike for a minimum wage of 6 pence an hour. 6 pence an hour would be about 2.5 pence in today's currency, which is very little. But given the price levels back in 1889, the dockers considered that to be a living wage. But the fact was that the workers had more confidence now in going on strike. They had more ability to take on the employers and negotiate with the employers, and negotiate almost as equals with the employers, and try to get some concessions off the employers in terms of remuneration and conditions of employment. As I said earlier, the trade union movement supported the development of the Labour Party, which funded and supported the trade union initiative. So there was a political dimension to the development of the trade unions, and that was the Labour Party. And the Labour Party developed in the UK over this period. It didn't have power in the early days, and it attracted many famous writers and socialists, not just from the UK, but from right across Europe, and attracted the attention of many people. It developed a political consciousness amongst the workers, and they were planning what sort of society should there be, and how should they live, and what should be the conditions of employment. And it cut across all sorts of areas. The desire to have a health service, for example, or universal education for children, and workers' rights, and all of these issues were being debated back then. They were not being implemented, but at least they were being debated. In 1906, the Labour Party introduced the Trade Disputes Act, which prevented organisations from suing unions for any damages incurred by strike action. So now the unions could take action and not be sued for, say, loss of profits by the employers. So that was a major breakthrough for the unions. The unions were now able to take strike action on behalf of their members and not be punished by the law, go to court and have to pay for the consequences of the strike action. The Labour Party was one of the UK's most influential parties and provided securities for trade unions and their initiatives. So the Labour Party developed, this political end of the trade union movement developed. It became quasi-separate. There's still many connections, even to this present day. There are many connections between the Labour Party and the trade unions. One grew out of the other, and they were supporting each other. In 1926, Britain witnessed one of its national strikes, the general strike, which affected trade and major industries. I mentioned this earlier. It was the coal miners who wanted an increase in pay. The coal miners retaliated by locking them out, and then there was a strike. But the coal miners owners, the coal mines owners, refused to concede higher wages because they believed higher wages would lead to an increase in the coal price, less coal would be sold, and the industry would be damaged. So the mine owners refused to concede. So there then started a general strike. The rest of the trade unions came out on strike in sympathy with the coal miners. The general strike, I think, lasted about 9 days. So everyone stayed out of work for about 9 days, and then they started to go back to work. Mostly strikes were broken because the workers needed the money. They had to buy food and pay for accommodation and so on. so they couldn't afford to stay out on strike for a long time. But they were out for about 9 days. The coal miners themselves stayed out for months, but eventually they lost. I mean, eventually they went back to work at the wage dictated by the mine owners. But that was the first general strike. That was a major event in trade union and political history. It involved 2 million workers from industries such as transport, iron, coal, steel, gas, electricity, right across the whole country stopped. And they stopped in sympathy with the coal miners. It had a negative impact on the trade union movement. People were confused about what was achieved. It seemed like a lot of people had lost and nothing had been achieved. So there was a lot of frustration on the part of many people about the general strike. And this looked bad for the trade unions. It rubbed off negatively on the trade unions. The Trade Disputes Act of 1927 made general strikes illegal. So the government were emboldened by the negative publicity that the general strike had got the trade union movement, so they passed Trade Disputes Act 1927, making general strikes illegal. So the rise in power of trade unions began during the Labour government. Legislation and policies were in favour of trade unions. For example, the Industrial Relations Act, now moving on in time to, say, 1971. The Industrial Relations Act of 1971, the introduction of the Social Security system, the establishment of ACAS, the Arbitration and Conciliation Service. In 1971, trade union membership rose to 13 million. During this period, Britain witnessed the greatest number of strike actions and economic crisis. We talk about economic crisis. The fact is, when people do go on strike, there is obviously disruption to production and to industry and commerce and so on, and that can be counterproductive. Sometimes the workers lose as a consequence of the action. Companies do go out of business, and there may be issues about companies relocating or trimming back on the workforce. So 1971 was a peak year for strike action. The fall in trade union power occurred in 1979 during widespread strike action on public services. This was a major cause for economic crisis. 1979, the unions called strike action over public services, for example, road cleaning, refuge collection and so on. And it was felt that the trade unions had gone too far. They started to lose public support. There were situations where the dead were not being buried, apparently. So it was a situation where people were starting to lose sympathy for the trade union movement. They felt it had gone too far. It was known as the Winter of Discontent, 1979, and it lasted for many years, in a sense. The Winter of Discontent was there, but it dragged on for many years, and it had an impact on the public sector, on the growth of the public sector, the way the public sector was managed, the types of services offered by the public service, to some extent were influenced also by the involvement of the trade unions. But it started in 1979, the Winter of Discontent, but as I said, it set in motion the power of the trade unions, which lasted for many years. Strikes had hit a peak during this period, causing the Labour Party to lose power to the Conservative Party. The country was turning against trade unions. They saw the trade unions as too powerful, and there was a confusion almost who was running the country. Was it the government or was it the trade unions? And the Labour Party, who were associated with the trade unions, lost power to the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party in the UK is more pro business owners. At least it was then. The Conservative Party in the present day would argue that it is pro just about everyone. It's pro workers and pro business. It's people working together. So, but at that time, the Conservative Party would be seen as more pro business. So, the Conservative Party was ushered into power. The Conservative government weakened the powers of the trade unions, and strikes and industrial action declined significantly. They weakened the power of the trade unions by different pieces of legislation, and also not negotiating and not having sympathy for the cases brought forward by the trade unions. The trade unions were increasingly marginalised by the government, and the press and public opinion was moving against the trade unions. From 1980 to 1990, union membership dropped sharply, caused by a decline of the manufacturing, coal, steel, iron and cotton industries. Between 1980 and 1990, there was a major restructuring of British industry, and there was increasing movement towards services in the economy. So traditional manufacturing became less important. The coal industry was under threat from imports, and also there was increasing reliance on, for example, nuclear electrical generation, and those would come on tap. And also steel production was facing considerable competition from overseas, as was the cotton industry. So there was major restructuring of industry, and the trade unions were seen as increasingly outdated in terms of this restructuring. And this led to the government broadly almost ignoring the trade unions, but the trade unions themselves were in the meantime getting bad press and seen as more out of date. Sectors such as services, finance, voluntary, fashion, these gained in importance. So the economy was restructuring, and membership in these sectors has always been weak, and very few people in the voluntary sector join trade unions, or in the fashion industry or finance. They're not noted for their participation in industrial disputes or industrial relations exercises, and the language of the trade unions was seen as increasingly antiquated, and their processes were antiquated. Everything was out of date, everything was historic. The country wanted to move on and develop a new image and new types of industry. So the trade unions were seen as increasingly less relevant. So the reasons for the decline in the trade unions, well, changes in government policies and legislation have made trade unions weaker. For example, the abolition of the closed shop and banning secondary picketing. The closed shop was when trade unions insisted that anybody working for that particular company must be a member of the trade union. Well, the government changed the law on that, so anyone could join the company and not have to join the trade union. The closed shop was abolished. And secondary picketing, it was legal for people in a company to picket the organisation in the event of a dispute. In other words, stand outside the gates of the company and perhaps try to persuade workers not to go in and work, or try to persuade delivery people not to make deliveries, and so on, to try and hurt the company, to force the company to negotiate. That's picketing. But secondary picketing is when workers from other companies, not related to the strike, come and help out. That may be seen as intimidating or threatening to people who perhaps wanted to work. So the government had weakened the trade unions in this period. There was also, in a very general sense here, a movement in economic policy away from what was known as Keynesian economics, which was interventionist economics to regulate the economy to bring about full employment, movement towards monetarism. And monetarism simply reverted back to market forces. Now, there's a lot more to monetarism than market forces, like I've just suggested, but there was a greater emphasis on market forces. And this meant that the trade unions, if they went on strike, the government would not get involved in the strike. If the trade unions managed to win concessions off the employers, and if as a consequence the company was about to close down because it couldn't afford to continue operations because of perhaps some pay claim that they had conceded, the government would allow the company to close down. It wouldn't bail out the company, which meant the trade unions had to take a lot of responsibility for the success of the company. Now this was different, and this weakened the trade unions again. So the decline of the industrial sector resulted in rapid falls in employment, and the government changing legislation was also a big issue. The weaker membership in the new industries, the service sector, telecommunications and so on, reduced overall membership and reduced the influence of the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, because now it was speaking for less unionised workers. But also globalisation put pressures on industries and competition. More work, more traditional manufacturing work was going overseas. There were plants opening in other countries to make the products which were in the past made in the UK. But perhaps the UK was now seen as high cost. So therefore the plants were opening elsewhere and leading to redundancies in the UK. So unemployment was rising. Again, weakening the trade unions. High unemployment in the UK resulted in less power and influence for the trade unions, because globalisation, new technologies, and a restructuring of the economy all combined to weaken the trade unions. There's still a major organisation in the UK. They still play a key role in employee welfare. They're still an important organisation. They still highlight issues, bring issues to public notice, and they also make a very valuable contribution in monitoring working conditions in other countries and making us aware of the conditions in other countries, and have loyalty to organisations in other countries who are trying to bring about reform and introduce fairness into the production system in other countries. It's as if the UK has gone through the process. It went through the process first, and now we can see the same arguments and the same issues arising in other countries. So the trade unions in the UK know what happened, they know their own history, so they're able to make us aware of this. But also they monitor working conditions and wages and salaries in the UK, and they publish a lot of good research papers, and they are a voice that can be used in opposition to what the employers are saying. So an argument, a balanced argument hopefully, can result, which leads to greater responsibility by the managers and by the owners of business, and also a greater responsibility and a greater understanding on the part of the trade unions. So it's a much more, in a sense, rational environment as a consequence of the trade unions. Due to changes in policies and legislation has weakened trade union power. This type and use of industrial action Um, so changes in government policies and legislation clearly have had an impact, and this has been long run. It's happened over many years, but also across several governments. For example, the Tony Blair government, the Labour government, many people criticise for not having reformed the various pieces of legislation put in place by the previous Conservative government related to trade union law and trade union power. Whether that's the case or not is debatable, and we're not going to get into it here, but it does seem to be the case that trade union power has been clipped year upon year over probably the last 30 years. Since the 18th century, legislation has strengthened, and there are laws in place to protect employees, such as the Employment Relations Act, discrimination, equal pay, minimum pay, discrimination and harassment. So it's as if the government, perhaps recognising what the trade unions are saying and bowing to pressure and to recommendations from the trade unions, they've introduced legislation which regulates working conditions. But this, of course, in turn weakens the need for the trade unions in the long run. It's as if government has taken on the role of monitoring working conditions, monitoring wages, national minimum wage, for example, working conditions, statutory holidays, and so on, which means the trade unions have less to argue about. So these are some of the reasons why the trade unions have declined in numbers. So what we've seen in this session is an increasing importance for trade unions, going back to the Industrial Revolution and the terrible conditions workers were in, and the need for the trade union movement because they had to negotiate better employment conditions and terms and better wages for the employees at that time. There was little likelihood of the employers voluntarily making these concessions. But then there were various acts of parliament constraining the trade unions, the combination acts and so on, and eventually the trade unions won the arguments and gained concessions, but then went through the peak of their power, and now they've been weakened by various other situations: globalization, increasing technology, the increasing role of the government in employment and employment practices, globalization, as I just said. So overall there's been a weakening of the trade unions in the last probably 20, maybe 25 years. That's all we're going to deal with here, so we're going to leave it at that and say this was a very brief history of the development of the trade unions, almost a rise and fall of the trade union movement in the UK. That's all we're going to deal with. There are some sources that we looked at in the preparation of this material. So let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.